What if you're not bad at handling anxiety? You're just using the wrong map. Think about that for a second. Not the wrong attitude, not the wrong effort, the wrong map. Most of what you've been told about anxiety assumes the goal is to make it stop. Breathe slower, think positive, push through. And when none of that works, the conclusion feels obvious. Something must be wrong with you. But here's what no one tells you up front. Anxiety doesn't respond to force the way we expect it to. Not because you're weak, not because you haven't tried hard enough, but because the part of your brain driving anxiety isn't listening to the part of your brain trying to reason with it. That's not a character flaw. That's just how the wiring works. In this video, we're going to go through 6 things not to silence anxiety, but to understand it well enough that it stops making your decisions for you. There's a question that almost no anxiety guide ever starts with. Not, how bad is your anxiety? Not, how long have you had it? But this one. What kind of anxiety are you actually dealing with? It sounds simple. It changes everything. Most guides skip it entirely. They go straight to the techniques. Breathe slower, journal more, meditate for 10 minutes a day. And for some people, that works. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. And when it doesn't, there's a very predictable next step. They decide something must be wrong with them. That conclusion is almost always wrong. Using the wrong tool doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're using a scalpel to cut grass. The tool works fine. It's just built for something else entirely. So let's look at what's actually different. Situational anxiety has a clear reason behind it. A job interview coming up, a difficult conversation you've been putting off, a deadline that's 3 days away and you're not ready. You feel the pressure, your body responds, and then once the thing is over, it fades. That's not a malfunction. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Prepare you for something that matters, then stand down. The timeline on this is usually a few hours to a few days. You feel it spike, it peaks, it comes down. Your body knows how to complete that cycle. It's been doing it your whole life. Chronic anxiety is different. Not a little different. Completely different. There's no clear reason for it. You wake up on a Tuesday with nothing unusual on the calendar, and it's already there, sitting in your chest before you've had a single thought about the day. Nothing happened. Nothing is obviously wrong, and yet the feeling doesn't leave. This isn't your nervous system reacting to a threat. This is your nervous system treating threat as its default setting. The alarm isn't sounding because something triggered it. The alarm is just on, all the time. That's what makes it so exhausting and so hard to explain to people who don't experience it. Here's why this distinction matters more than anything else you'll hear today. The techniques that work well for situational anxiety, box breathing, cold exposure, grounding exercises, are built around interruption. They work by breaking the spike before it escalates, and they do that very well. For situational anxiety, you can feel a real difference in a few hours, sometimes less. But if your anxiety is chronic, those same techniques are doing something different. They're not interrupting a spike. They're giving you a way to turn the volume down slightly on a signal that's running all the time. That's genuinely useful, but it's not transformation. It's management. And management requires a different timeline. Research out of Harvard on what's called the cortisol awakening response, the sharp rise in stress hormone that happens in the first 20 to 30 minutes after you wake up, shows that people with chronic anxiety have meaningfully higher cortisol levels in the morning, even after a full night of sleep, even when nothing stressful is happening. The baseline is elevated, not because of something they did, not because they're thinking wrong. The level is just set higher. Bringing that baseline down doesn't happen in a few days. It happens over weeks of consistent practice. Not dramatic practice, not perfect practice, just consistent. This isn't discouraging. It's actually the most useful thing you can know before you start. If you've been working on your anxiety and the techniques aren't working, there's a real chance they are working just for a different problem than the one you have. Or they're working, but you stopped before the timeline required for your type of anxiety. Neither of those is failure. Which one are you dealing with right now? There's a piece of advice almost everyone with anxiety has received at least once. From a parent, a friend, a well-meaning colleague. Delivered with genuine care, usually right in the middle of the worst moment. Just don't think about it. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, you already know it doesn't help. But here's what's interesting. Most people assume it doesn't help because they're not trying hard enough. Because their mind is too restless, too stubborn, too prone to running in circles. That assumption is wrong. And the reason it's wrong has nothing to do with your willpower. In 1987, a psychologist named Daniel Wegner at Harvard ran a simple experiment. He asked participants to sit quietly for 5 minutes and think about anything they wanted with one condition. Do not think about a white bear. That's it. Just don't think about a white bear. The results were striking. Participants thought about the white bear more than once every minute on average, more frequently than people in a separate group who were simply told to think about whatever they wanted with no restriction at all. The harder they tried not to think about it, the more it showed up. Wegner called this ironic process theory. The name sounds academic, but the experience is something almost everyone recognizes immediately. You're trying to fall asleep, and you tell yourself, don't think about tomorrow's presentation. And suddenly that's the only thing you can think about. So why does this happen? When your brain receives an instruction like, don't think about X, it has to do two things at the same time. First, it tries to carry out the suppression, pushing the thought away. But second, and this is the part that undoes everything, it has to keep monitoring to check whether the suppression is working. And to check whether you're thinking about X, your brain has to hold X in view. That monitoring process, quiet, automatic, running in the background, is what keeps the thought alive. It's not a failure of concentration. It's not weakness. It's the way the job of don't think about this is built. The instruction contains its own undoing. This is why just don't worry about it is the least useful advice anyone can give someone with anxiety. Not because the person saying it doesn't care, but because the request itself suppresses that thought, requires the brain to keep returning to the very thing it's trying to suppress. The instruction and the outcome are working against each other by design. Here's what this actually means for you. You can't force a thought out. Not through willpower, not through distraction in the loose sense of the word, not through telling yourself it's irrational. The brain doesn't respond to go away when the instruction to go away keeps pointing back at the thing you want gone. But there is something that does work, and it's not suppression.
You can give the brain something else to track, something specific enough, present enough, that it actually takes up the attention that the anxious thought was occupying. Not pushing the thought out, replacing what the brain is following. The difference between those two things is not small. Pushing out requires force and fails by design. Replacing requires giving the brain a real object, something it can actually focus on. And that's a different instruction entirely. That's what the next section is about. Not managing the thought by willpower, but understanding what your brain actually needs in order to shift. The research on this is specific, and the practice that follows from it is simpler than most people expect. Before we get there, has anyone ever told you not to worry and it actually worked?
Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious because in years of reading about this, I haven't found a single case study where "just don't think about it" produced lasting relief. But I'd like to be wrong. The last section ended with a question about what actually works instead of suppression. This is the answer. But it's not what most people expect. When anxiety hits, really hits, the instinct is to reason your way out of it, to remind yourself the fear isn't logical, to take a breath and think clearly, to talk yourself down. And it almost never works in the moment. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because the part of your brain driving the anxiety has already, for a brief window of time, taken the part of your brain responsible for clear thinking, mostly offline. Here's what's happening. Deep inside the brain sits a small region called the amygdala. Its job is to detect threat and respond fast, faster than conscious thought. Faster, in fact, by about 200 milliseconds. That gap doesn't sound like much, but it's the difference between a reflex and a decision.
By the time you're aware you're anxious, your amygdala has already been running for a fifth of a second. When it fires, it sends a signal that temporarily reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles reasoning, perspective, and calm evaluation of a situation. The two regions are in a kind of seesaw relationship. When one goes up, the other tends to come down. So when anxiety is peaking, the part of you that could think clearly about it is, for a moment, the quietest part of the room. That's not weakness. That's just the order of operations your brain is running. Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher who spent the early part of his life as a slave in Rome, before eventually gaining his freedom and founding his own school, wrote something that maps onto this more precisely than it might first appear. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. On the surface, that reads like advice about acceptance, about letting go of what you can't control, but there's a more specific observation underneath it. Epictetus was drawing a line between what belongs to you and what doesn't. And when you put that next to what we now know about the amygdala, the line becomes very clear. The first reaction, the spike, the lurch, the feeling that arrives before you've had a single conscious thought, that doesn't belong to you. It arrived before your decision-making self was even in the room. But what happens in the 3 seconds after that does. That window, those 3 seconds, is where Epictetus was pointing. Not suppression, not control. The best use of what is actually in your power. In 2007, a neuroscientist named Matthew Lieberman at UCLA ran a study that made this very concrete. He had participants look at photographs of faces showing strong emotions: fear, anger, distress. He measured their brain activity while they looked. Predictably, the amygdala lit up. Strong signal, reactive mode. Then he made one small change. He asked a second group of participants to do something while looking at the same photos. Put a word to what they were seeing. Just label the emotion on the face. Scared, angry, upset. One word. When participants added that single label, amygdala activity measurably decreased and prefrontal cortex activity increased. The brain shifted. Not through breathing, not through reasoning, not through willpower, through the act of naming. Lieberman called this affect labeling. What it showed, in plain terms, is that the act of putting language to an emotional state changes how the brain processes it. Naming an emotion is not just describing it. It is, in a very literal sense, a different instruction to the brain about what to do with the signal. This is where it becomes immediately useful. You don't need to understand the neuroscience. You don't need to believe it. The practice is simple enough that it works without either. The next time anxiety arrives, whether it's a small tightening before a meeting,
or something that wakes you up at 3 in the morning, say this, out loud or silently, whichever feels right. This is anxiety. Not, why am I feeling this? Not, is this making sense? Not a question, not an argument, not a reassurance, just the name. 2 seconds, 3 words. You're not trying to make the feeling go away. You're not evaluating whether it's rational. You're doing the one thing Lieberman's research showed the brain responds to, placing language on the experience. That's what moves the needle from reactive to observing, from flooded to present. It won't feel dramatic. That's actually the point. The shift isn't emotional, it's neurological. Small, immediate, and available every single time. Try it right now. You don't have to be anxious. Think of something that's been sitting in the back of your mind, something unsettled, unresolved. Say the word for it out loud or in your head.
Notice whether anything changes, even slightly, in how the thought sits in your body. That's the switch. It was always there. Morning anxiety has a specific reason behind it, and it's not what most people think. Your body produces a hormone called cortisol, the main stress hormone. Every morning, regardless of what's happening in your life, cortisol rises sharply in the first 20 to 30 minutes after you wake up. This is called the cortisol awakening response, and it's completely normal. It's your body's way of preparing you for the demands of the day, mobilizing energy, sharpening attention, getting systems online. But in people with chronic anxiety, that morning rise is higher and stays elevated longer. And here's the part that matters. The brain doesn't receive that cortisol signal and think, I'm getting ready for the day. It receives it and starts scanning for the reason you must be worried. Before you've checked your phone, before you've remembered anything on your calendar, the feeling is already there, formless, unnamed, just present. And the brain, trying to make sense of it, starts looking for something to attach it to. This is why morning anxiety often feels unconnected to anything real. It's not a premonition. It's not evidence that something is wrong. It's biology arriving before thought does. So, what do most people do in those first 10 minutes? They reach for their phone. And this is where the day either steadies or escalates. Every notification, every headline, every unread message is a new signal going straight to the amygdala, which, as we covered earlier, is already at its most reactive point of the entire day. You're feeding new inputs into the most alert, least rational version of your brain at the exact window when the cortisol is still cresting. The result isn't just feeling worse. It's that the cortisol peak, which would naturally begin to drop after 20 to 30 minutes, gets extended. More fuel, longer burn. And you carry that elevated baseline into the first hour, which shapes the emotional tone of everything that follows. 10 minutes. That window is not small. Here's what to do instead. 3 steps, and you only need to do all 3 once to understand why they work. Step 1. No phone for the first 10 minutes. Put it in another room if you can. If that's not possible, put it face down and don't pick it up. Not permanently, just for 10 minutes. You're not avoiding the world. You're giving the amygdala the one thing it needs after a night of sleep, a few minutes of low stimulation before the day's demands arrive. That window is when cortisol naturally begins its descent. The phone interrupts that descent before it starts. Step 2. Name your state before you stand up. 30 seconds. Still in bed. Sit for a moment. Don't check anything. Don't plan anything. Just notice what's already there and say it, out loud or silently. This morning I'm feeling anxious, or unsettled, or heavy,
or fine, whatever is actually true. This is the same labeling practice from the Lieberman research we talked about, the one that measurably shifted brain activity from reactive to observing. You are doing it at the moment of the day when it costs the least and matters the most, before the noise starts. Step 3. One physical action with weight. Both feet flat on the floor. Notice the temperature of the floor against your skin. Then drink a glass of water before you do anything else, and pay attention to the sensation of it, just briefly. The temperature, the feeling of it moving down your throat. This is not meditation. It doesn't require stillness or silence or any particular mindset. It's a concrete physical signal, something your body can actually register right now, in this room, at this moment. It gives the nervous system something real to attend to, instead of an imagined threat it's been preparing for since before you opened your eyes.
Marcus Aurelius, who governed the Roman Empire during some of its most turbulent decades, and kept a private journal now known as the Meditations, wrote this as a daily reminder to himself. Confine yourself to the present. Not as philosophy, as morning practice. He returned to that instruction day after day, year after year, not because it became unnecessary, but because the mind, left without direction, reliably drifts toward what hasn't happened yet. The Meditations weren't written as a finished document. They were notes he kept for himself, reminders he apparently needed to repeat. That repetition is worth noticing. Even the person writing the book on Stoic discipline needed to say it again the next morning. 3 steps, 10 minutes, repeated daily. That's the scope of what this asks. It won't feel like a transformation the first time. That's actually correct. It's not supposed to. What you're doing is narrowing the window between waking and stability. The first morning, it might shrink by 2 minutes. After 2 weeks of doing it consistently, it might shrink by 15. You probably won't notice the change while it's happening. You'll notice it one morning, when you realize the anxiety was lower before you even started the day, and you're not sure when that shifted. That's the sign it's working. Not a dramatic before and after, a quieter baseline, built one morning at a time. Tomorrow morning, try step 1 only. Just that. Don't pick up your phone for the first 10 minutes. See what the morning feels like when that's the only thing you change. Every approach we've covered so far, the labeling, the morning protocol, the understanding of how the brain shifts, all of them share the same underlying question. How do I reduce this? That's a reasonable question. In many situations, it's the right one. But there's a different question that almost never gets asked. And for some people, at some moments, it's the more honest question. What is this anxiety actually here for? Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher writing in the 19th century, made an observation that most anxiety guides skip entirely. He wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Not freedom as a pleasant thing, freedom as a specific condition. You are standing at a point where more than one direction is genuinely possible, and there is no way to know in advance which one is right. The ground isn't unstable. The future simply hasn't been decided yet. Kierkegaard noticed something in this that's easy to miss. Anxiety, he argued, is only possible in a creature that has real choices. A machine doesn't experience it. The output is already determined. But a person standing at an actual crossroads, where what they do next genuinely matters and genuinely isn't fixed, that person feels it. Not because something is wrong, because something is real. This reframes the feeling entirely. The difficult conversation you've been putting off,
the one that keeps surfacing at inconvenient times. You're anxious about it because the outcome actually depends on what you do, and because it matters to you what the outcome is. The anxiety isn't noise. It's a signal that this particular thing has weight. People who have stopped caring don't feel this kind. They've already decided it doesn't matter, or that they can't affect it, or both. Anxiety, by this reading, shows up specifically where something still has stakes, and where you're still awake enough to feel them. This isn't just philosophy. It connects directly to how anxiety was understood in American clinical psychology in the 1950s, when a therapist named Rollo May began bringing existential ideas into the treatment room. May spent decades working with people whose anxiety had become debilitating, not just uncomfortable, but genuinely limiting. And yet his definition of normal anxiety, the kind that visits almost everyone, was precise. He described it as the appropriate reaction to a threat to values that the individual identifies as essential to existence. That's a long phrase, but it points at something simple. Anxiety shows up around what you care about, around what, if lost or damaged, would feel like losing a piece of who you are. The job you've worked toward, the relationship you're trying to repair, the version of yourself you're still trying to become. May's point wasn't that anxiety is comfortable or that you should welcome it. His point was that trying to eliminate it without first asking what it's protecting is a bit like treating a fever without checking whether the fever is fighting something. This doesn't mean every anxious feeling needs to be unpacked. Some anxiety is just the nervous system running too hot, and the tools in this video labeling it, the morning protocol, understanding how the brain shifts modes, those are still useful, they still apply. But there are moments, usually the ones where the anxiety keeps returning even after you've done everything right, when the more useful move isn't to quiet it further. It's to sit with it for a moment and ask a different question. Not, how do I make this stop, but what is this protecting? Sometimes the answer is something you'll want to hear. A friendship that matters more than you've been admitting. A decision you've been delaying because it would require you to be honest about something. A value that the anxiety has been quietly standing guard over while you were busy trying to turn it off. Not every anxiety is carrying this kind of message, but some are. And the ones that are, they tend to be the ones that keep coming back, regardless of technique, regardless of how well you manage everything else. Because they're not a malfunction. They're a question that hasn't been answered yet. What is your anxiety protecting right now?
You don't have to answer out loud. You don't have to say it to anyone. But if you sit with the question for even 30 seconds, not to solve it, just to let it be asked, you might find the feeling shifts slightly. Not because the anxiety goes away, but because you've stopped treating it as the problem and started listening to what it might be pointing at. That's a different relationship with it entirely, and it leads somewhere different than management does. There's a definition of success that almost everyone working on anxiety carries without realizing it. It goes something like this. If I do this well enough, for long enough, the anxiety will eventually stop coming. That's the finish line, the absence of it, the silence. And by that definition, almost everyone fails. Because anxiety, especially for people who are genuinely engaged with their lives, who have things they care about and outcomes that are not yet certain, does not simply stop arriving. Marcus Aurelius, who governed the Roman Empire through 2 decades of plague, military conflict, and the slow erosion of everything he'd built, kept a private journal now known as the Meditations. He was writing it in his 50s, after more than 20 years as emperor.
and the entries read like someone who was still, day after day, working through the same fears and doubts and impulses he had always worked through. He was not writing from the other side of the struggle. He was writing from inside it. Every day, returning to the same principles, not because he'd finally mastered them, but because the mind, left on its own, reliably drifted. He needed the reminders. The man who wrote some of history's most enduring words on self-discipline apparently still needed to remind himself of them every morning. That's worth sitting with. Because if the goal were absence, if mastery really meant the struggle was over, then the meditations would be a document of failure. And it's clearly not.
So what does progress actually look like? Not absence. Speed. More precisely, the time between when anxiety arrives and when you find your way back to clear thinking. That window is what changes. It doesn't close permanently, but it gets shorter. An anxious spiral that used to run for an hour starts taking 15 minutes. The kind of worry that used to occupy you for a full week, coloring every conversation and every attempt to sleep, gradually compresses into an afternoon. You still feel it. The feeling is real. But the time you spend inside it, unable to see past it, decreases. This is the progress that doesn't look like progress because it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a slightly better Tuesday. It feels like noticing, almost by accident, that you recovered faster this time than last time. There's no dramatic before and after. There's just a quieter average, built from a long series of individual returns. The labeling practice from earlier in this video, naming the feeling before it accelerates, shortens that window directly. So does the morning protocol. Not by preventing anxiety from arriving, by reducing the time your nervous system spends in full reactive mode before it can settle. That's the actual mechanism. That's what consistent practice builds toward. 1 hour to 15 minutes, a week to an afternoon. Those are not metaphors. They are the realistic, measurable changes that people with chronic anxiety report after weeks of consistent practice, not weeks of perfect practice, just regular practice. The question worth carrying forward is not, when does this end? It's simpler and more honest than that. How long did it take this time? And after the next one, was it shorter? That's the only comparison that matters. Not you against some imagined version of yourself who no longer feels this way. You this week against you last month. Did the return take less time, even slightly? Then something is working. Even if it didn't feel like progress while it was happening. Progress in this territory is almost never visible from inside a difficult moment. It only shows up in retrospect, when you notice, sometime in the middle of an ordinary day, that the last hard stretch passed more quickly than the one before it. No one around you will have seen the difference. You might barely notice it yourself. But that quiet compression is real, and it compounds. This is what it actually means to get better at this. Not silence, not the end of difficulty. The ability to return faster, then faster again, every single time. If you're willing to measure your progress differently from this point on, drop this in the comments. I'm measuring return time, not absence. Not as a statement about where you are, as a decision about where you're looking. At the very start of this video, there was a question. Not a philosophical one, a practical one, the kind that shows up at 2 in the morning, or in the middle of a shower, or right before a meeting you can't avoid. Why do I know everything is fine and still can't stop worrying? That question isn't wrong. It's just asking the wrong thing. Not why. What? Anxiety doesn't need to be explained before it can be worked with. It needs to be recognized. Named, the way Matthew Lieberman's research showed the brain responds to a single word, shifting from reactive to observing. Asked, occasionally, what it might be protecting. And measured, not by whether it arrives, but by how quickly you find your way back. That's the full picture. Not a cure, a set of things you can actually do every time that build toward a quieter baseline one morning, one return, one named feeling at a time. The question worth carrying forward isn't, when does this end? It's simpler than that. Was the return faster this time than last time? That's it. That's the only measurement that tracks real progress. Not whether you felt anxious today, not whether the morning was hard, but whether the time between the spike and the return is, slowly and imperfectly, getting shorter. Some weeks it will be. Some weeks it won't, because progress in this territory is not a straight line, and setbacks are part of the practice, not failures within it. An hour-long spiral that eventually becomes 30 minutes is progress, even if it didn't feel like anything was working while you were inside it. A week of disrupted sleep that compresses into 2 days is progress, even if 2 days still felt long. The returns accumulate. The baseline drops. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone around you will notice or comment on. But you'll feel it one ordinary Tuesday, when the anxious feeling came and went without taking the whole afternoon with it, and you realize, quietly, that that used to take until Thursday. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was born into slavery in ancient Greece and spent years with no freedom over his circumstances at all, wrote the simplest instruction he ever left behind. First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Know what kind of person you're trying to become. Then do what that requires, not once, not when it's easy, but each time the situation calls for it. That's the whole practice, not a destination, not a fixed point you reach after enough good mornings and enough named feelings and enough returns. Just the repeated act of showing up to it each day, each morning, each time anxiety arrives, and choosing, again, what you're going to do with the next 3 seconds. Not because it stops being hard, because you've decided what kind of person you want to be when it is. If this video found you when you needed it, I'd ask you to leave just one thing in the comments. Not an affirmation, not a summary of what you learned. The question you're going to ask yourself next time. Not my question, yours. The one that, after everything in this video, feels most honest to where you are right now. What is it?